Everybody, welcome back to 11th grade U.S. history with Mr. Bennett. Today we're going to be looking at Lesson 5 of Chapter 15, Crisis and Resurgence, focusing on George Herbert Walker Bush and the early 1990s, picking up where we left off with Reagan leaving office and the USSR coming to a grinding halt. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that happened in the late 80s and early 90s under this outstanding gentleman here on the left, right? Bush Sr. It's going to be a short one today. Not a whole lot to discuss, but a few major items. So let's pick up with it right now. So let's talk very quickly about things happening here in the United States under George H.W. Bush, right? His domestic policy, things happening in the U.S. So Bush, super duper qualified to be the president of the USA. So he'd spent 2 years as vice president, 2 terms, I should say, 2 terms as vice president under Ronald Reagan. He ends up being like Reagan light, diet Ronald Reagan. Continues the focus on education and this war on drugs and the war on crime, which will really be a theme throughout the 90s, as Bill Clinton's going to do this too. Now, the deficit was a problem, right? We spent all that money on the military, but we also lowered taxes. And the problem with that is you can't spend money and then take less money in, because then you end up in the hole, right? So we're deeply, deeply in debt at this point. So we have to start cutting military spending under George H.W. Bush. And that's a little unpopular, but he is doing it for the right reasons. Now, it was a better situation than in Eastern Europe. Things are kind of falling apart across the pond. So he does do something really notable. It was kind of a huge snafu at the time, because in his inauguration and in his campaign, George H.W. Bush had promised no new taxes for the rich, because they could see the writing on the wall that the deficit was growing. And so he says, read my lips, no new taxes. And then by the end of his term, he has put in place new taxes on the wealthy to kind of help us dig ourselves out of debt. In regards to the Supreme Court, he does appoint more Supreme Court justices, and it makes it a conservative majority on the court. Collectively, they do toughen rules on criminal defendants and start trying to challenge abortion rights and access to abortions. That is a pretty standard conservative agenda throughout the 80s and early 90s. In terms of the ongoing economic recession, the proof was in the pudding that Reaganomics was not working. The trade imbalance was growing, meaning we were buying more things than we were selling. And ultimately, our steel industry starts to collapse. And so we start having to bail out some of these steel businesses, and Americans are leaving the Rust Belt. That is going to be the north central region of the United States, the former Midwest, right, where you've got all these steel and iron factories. People start moving from those places into the Sun Belt to the south, and we'll talk about that a little bit under Bill Clinton. So they start moving their manufacturing overseas again because it's cheaper, right? We've got to make things where it's more affordable. And then in 1992, really the biggest civil and domestic issue that we have to deal with is the refocusing on race issues in America. So in 1992, you have the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. So if you want to watch a little bit on those, I've got a couple of videos in the slides. But just to lay it out as briefly as I can, you've got Rodney King, a young African-American man. He gets pulled over by the police in Los Angeles. They accost him and they beat him to a pulp. And a nearby, just a bystander, somebody in their apartment complex, happens to have a video camera, and they start filming this, and they get it all on tape. And long story short, all of these cops get off with either nothing happening to them or just essentially a slap on the wrist. And Los Angeles is furious, right? They nearly beat Rodney King to death, and nothing happens to these white police officers. And so for weeks and weeks and weeks, downtown Los Angeles is just like a Mad Max Thunderdome hellscape where you could not go in. And so I recommend that you watch these videos from the slides. One is of the actual police brutality itself, and the other is a clip of a white truck driver who's pulled from the cab of his truck and is also beaten nearly to death. And so ultimately, over the course of these weeks, you end up with 63 individuals are killed, over 2,000 are injured, and 12,000 people get arrested, predominantly Black and, more importantly, Hispanic people. Lots of Black and Hispanic people in downtown LA were arrested. And then one of the more positive aspects of the George H.W. Bush domestic policy would be the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Long story short, it makes it so that you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities in the workplace and schools. Businesses have to provide accommodations for employees. You have to make it within reason that they can work there and be functional. Here we see some pictures of the Los Angeles riots. If you want to pause and go ahead and look at those, that's fine. The top right, we see police officers outside of what appears to be some kind of store. On the bottom center, we have, I believe, from what I recall, that is a Korean store owner, and just general pictures of the mayhem taking place in downtown LA. Very briefly, let's hit on the foreign policy things that happened under George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1989, we assist in the democratic liberation of Panama. George H.W. Bush sends forces to capture the dictator / drug dealer Manuel Noriega, and ultimately they capture him and they establish a new democratic government, essentially by force. And if I'm not wrong, this mission was in one of the recent like Call of Duty video games, but I want to say it was like Black Ops 2 or something. And then finally, the Cold War comes to an official end. So Eastern Europe, all the Soviet bloc, those border countries between Eastern and Western Europe, are finally given true, genuine democratic governments, and the USSR, the Soviet Union, officially dissolves in 1991, and then we recognize them and start providing aid to Russia and these new countries now that they are no longer communist, right? We start selling things to them, and our tune kind of changes, and that's why Russia today is kind of a weird ally to us. And then in 1990, we begin the Gulf War, a pretty short conflict, but you've got Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq. He invades Kuwait, a neighboring country on the coast. His goal to expand the borders and seize the oil reserves of Kuwait. And so we, along with the United Nations, go back, and we're only in there for a few days. I think we have a bombing for weeks, but boots on the ground are only there for a few days. Ultimately, Saddam Hussein does pull out, and he agrees to pay damages, but he ends up being a problematic figure in the Middle East up until the 2000s following 9/11. And then in Somalia, very briefly in 1992, right before he leaves office, Bush starts sending humanitarian aid to Somalia in Africa, northeastern Africa, because they have essentially a civil war going on there. And all the warlords who are involved in the civil war start stealing the supplies. And so Bush, before leaving office, commits to sending troops, and then he bounces out and leaves it to Bill Clinton to handle. And that's really the last we'll talk of it. Eventually, we just kind of reduce our troops there and have a less visible presence in northeastern Africa. And that cuts it for George H.W. Bush. If you really want to test your noggin, there is an essay prompt here that I would love for you to give a go at. So what I would like you to do is tell me the story of our involvement in the Middle East from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I've got a laundry list of things I would like you to discuss and to tell me what the conflict was and what was the U.S. role in it, starting with the Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War, going through to the oil crisis, the Camp David Accords and subsequent fallout, the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis, the invasion of Lebanon, what happens in Libya, the Iran-Contra affair, and then finally wrapping it up in the Gulf War. If you want to go above and beyond, right, you could talk about 9/11, Afghanistan, and Iraq, but I'm not asking for that just yet at this point. So, like I said, super short video. Hopefully everybody's still doing well, and I'll see you in the next video with one of my favorite presidents, right, the president from my childhood,